Hello, welcome to Week 8, Lecture 2. In our Week 8 session of The Heir of the Common Man as on the syllabus. Today we're going to take a look at white male citizenship and property requirements. A recap. What kind of restrictions did the Constitution place on democracy? We're going to go back to our discussion of the Constitution briefly. What kind of restrictions were placed on the citizenship of white males in the early republic? Why did these restrictions first disappear in the new western states as they came into the Union? How did the restrictions eventually fall in the original 13 states? We'll take a look at the ideas of a man named Alexis de Tocqueville, and what did he have to say about American democracy, and how did he define American democracy. So we're going to take a look at that in this little mini lecture. Now again, I'm going to turn off my camera, and we're going to focus just on the PowerPoint presentation. As we saw in our discussions of the American Revolution and the formation of the Constitution, there was great concern among the political leadership of the new United States of America in the late 18th century about the dangers of the common people having too many rights, too much influence over the government, too much say in the democracy. And so as we saw, they tried to kind of distance democracy from the people to a certain extent. Things like the Senate, the Supreme Court, and other institutions that were created to kind of distance representative government from the people who were represented by, to kind of distance themselves so that democracy would not get out of hand as these political elites saw it. There was a fear of the mob, and so they tried to distance the government from the people. And to a certain extent, what the initial founders did was they tried to limit voting rights to prevent those with little or no property, the poor, from putting into office those who would pass laws undermining property rights, things like laws that would alleviate debt, that would allow for easy forgiveness of debt, which of course would hurt people who would hurt creditors who had money and favor those who had borrowed it, which were generally poor people, to try to prevent states from printing too much money, which again would be kind of the same effect by deflating the value of currency and therefore helping people in debt. They also put all kinds of measures that would enhance their own economic well-being at the expense of those with property and money. In other words, they limited voting rights to those with property because they felt they had a stake in the system, and they felt they were tended to have more. They would be more resistant to calls for negating certain property rights and so forth. So they really kind of wanted to distance democracy from the populace at large because they feared what this populace might do. Of course, in a sense, the reason for this, as they saw it, was that the revolution had unleashed strong democracy impulses that the elites had originally used to harness to defeat King George III of England, but then immediately wanted to put on a shorter leash now that these local political elites had become the leadership of this new country. And one of the ways they did this was they put into place a constitution. That reserved to the federal government, which was more distant from the people than state governments, certain powers like debt easement, the bankruptcy clause, for example, the ability to, as we talked about a moment ago, the ability to print money, contractual and obligations and relationships that you couldn't just pass laws, but the states couldn't pass laws that would overturn existing contracts that people had agreed to, and all kinds of things that they felt was necessary to protect the interest of the property, who they felt were key to developing a stable democracy and an effective economy. But there was a kind of a contradiction in the Constitution, and that is, even though these elites wanted to kind of distance democracy from the people, they also strongly believed in this idea of federalism. That is, that a certain degree of power should be maintained or kept by the states. They had to do this to deal with anti-federalist federalist opponents of the Constitution, and it's also just part of the reasons for the revolution. People didn't want a government that was so distant that they couldn't have any impact on it. And America being this gigantic continental republic, they felt that, a larger degree than in other countries like England, for example, they had to devolve power down to a lower level to the state. So there's this tension between how much power the central government could have and how much would be left to the states. And one of the things that they generally left to the states is the decision they left to the states who, as we talked about in the lecture before, who would be a citizen rather than determining at the federal level by the Constitution. They sort of left the question of who could be a citizen at the state level. And for the most part, the states kind of were in agreement on this. For example, women were not considered full citizens with the right to vote. African Americans, with very few exceptions, were considered citizens. Slaves in the southern states where they were predominated, but even in the north, were considered not to be citizens at all. And so the states kind of generally agreed on this thing, on general rules about who would be a citizen and therefore who could elect representatives to the states. But one thing that kind of varied a little bit, although not at first, was the idea of what about white men? What about white males? The dominant political grouping in the United States in terms of race and gender. And what most states did at the time of the constitutional ratification is they set into place property restrictions of various kinds. Now, they varied from state to state. In other words, you had to own a certain amount of property, usually real estate kind of property, land property, to determine whether you could participate in the vote, to determine representation, and then by representation, the kinds of laws that various states would pass. But the states determined who could be vote even in federal elections, not just state elections. Again, the Constitution kind of left it to them. And the states were kind of, at first, generally restricted to people with property. Now, it varied how much property each white male would have, depended on the state. The northern states tended to, particularly New England and stuff, tended to keep lower limits. Southern states where the planters dominated tend to have higher limits. But basically the idea was that, you wanted to have people, it was considered that people who had property were more stable, more educated, had more of a stake in the system. They wouldn't pass kind of laws that endangered property because they themselves owned property. They didn't want to have the vote going to people who had no property at all. They felt they didn't have a stake, and they might vote for representatives who would serve their interests by, undermining property rights, undermining contractual obligations, doing things like I said, debt easement and printing money and all kinds of things that would help those who have property. So all the states at first limited it to those who had property, but how much property varied. And so what we're going to be looking at now, and what this of course, what this particular week is sort of the basis of what this week is about, is how those property restrictions began to fall away in the first 50, 60 years of the American Republic following the Constitution, really predominantly in the first 40 years, actually, and then by 60 years, it was pretty much complete in all of the states. That how these property restrictions fell away. And this will, of course, by ending property restrictions, you vastly expand the electorate. Again, still reserved pretty much for white males only, but you're vastly expanding the electorate to include those who initially weren't considered to be worthy of getting the vote, were considered to be too dangerous to have the vote. But these property restrictions began to fall away. And so what we're going to look at now is how that process happened, so that by 1830, pretty much every white male in the United States, with some exceptions, some states were exceptions to this, particularly the South, that maintained property restrictions until about 1850. But how these restrictions fell away, and you develop this mass electorate of people. And then, of course, the question is, as you develop this mass electorate of people, how do you kind of maintain control over them and make sure that they don't do some of the things that the framers were worried about in terms of undermining property rights? So let's take a look at that process of ending property restrictions on the right of full citizenship and the right to vote. Here you see a map of the United States roughly around 1820, and you can see the various states, that the original 13 states along here, and then the states in the West, what was then the West, of course, now it's really part of the Midwest, what they were, how they came into the Union. And the story can be summarized like this. Over the first 60 years of the Constitution's ratification, property restrictions were dropped in state after state. And it began generally in the West. Every new state that came in, every single one of them came in after the ratification of the Constitution and the establishment of the first 13 states. And this began with Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee in the 1790s, and then the Inland South and the Old Northwest around the Great Lakes up through the 1850s. They dropped all property restrictions for full citizenship and the right to vote. And this makes sense. People who moved into these states were either people on the make, trying to make a life for themselves, gain property of their own, and also on the frontier in these open communities, there was a strong sense of equality, just a sort of sense we're all, everybody's kind of starting out the same, and the states, could create their own constitutions from scratch. They weren't inheriting something from prior to the Constitution, and so basically in all of these Western states, they precluded, they had no property restrictions on white men to vote. So you had a much wider franchise. In the original 13 states, property restrictions began to drop away, first in the North, and then after some resistance from planters in the South as well. This was largely done because of political pressure. White propertyless men, men without property, white men without property could not vote. They could make their demands known through other means, petition, marches, and also those with small amounts of property had generally risen. Many of them had risen from the class of people who had no property or knew people in it or related to people in it. And there was kind of a general insistence that all people, regardless of property, should vote. And so by the late 1820s, in most of the country, all white men could vote. And the culmination of their new political order was the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828, who both oversaw the full culmination of this expansion of democracy, but it also embodied what many saw as the dangers of democracy when it was expanded too widely and rapidly, what some of the framers had been worried about, and how this new, larger population of voters, the majority of them, those without property and others, might impact on minorities. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Right now, I'd like to talk about the ideas of a man named Alexis de Tocqueville. I want to discuss, as the text does, this business of national identity again. Because it helps to explain the expansion of political democracy in the early 1800s in the United States, at least the expansion of citizenship and voting rights to more and more white men. And the greatest explainer of this phenomenon, as the text notes, was ironically a French aristocrat named Alexis de Tocqueville, who, having seen some of the excesses of the revolution, or read about, by the 1840s, of course, the revolution had been 50 years behind some of the excesses of the revolution in his own land, he was rather wary of democracy, but no person, whether American or foreign, came to a better understanding of the nature of American democracy than de Tocqueville, and he is still widely read. And in his book, Democracy in America, it was a 2-volume book. One volume, the first volume came in 1835, the second volume in 1840, and he analyzed the nature of American democracy. He was a very perceptive observer. He first came to the United States to study our prisons, which were a model of rehabilitation at the time. Many Europeans were kind of curious of what Americans were doing in terms of these penitentiaries that America was building that were designed not so much to punish people, the idea at the time was, but to rehabilitate them. And so he was sent over by the French government to see what he could learn about American prisons. But while he was here, and in studying sort of the American prison system, he came to realize that really to fully understand it, he had to fully understand the country in which had gave birth to this idea of the penitentiary itself, the idea of a place where people would be rehabilitated to re-enter society, a very democratic idea. He had to understand the democracy itself that had created this prison system. And so he spent much of his time in America having not visiting prisons, although he did do that, and he did write up a report about the prisons. But mostly he focused on, just sort of studying American democracy generally. And in doing so, he said American democracy, and studying it and writing about it, he said it's more that American democracy was more than just representative government. He said that was simply the legal form of the United States. But he said there was something deeper. It was more even than he said than the idea of the sovereignty of the people, that the ultimate power lay with the people. He said, which was an Enlightenment idea that gone back to the late 1600s, and John Locke and others who had argued that a legitimate government must have the consent of the governed. He said it was more even than that basic idea. What de Tocqueville argued was that American democracy was really a culture, what he called a habit of the heart. And what he called it. Now, if we remember George Robert Twelves Hughes, remember that we talked about him during the Revolution, the shoemaker patriot who went from deferential supplicant, to John Hancock, kind of humbly asking for John Hancock's approval, to basically a proud, citizen of this new republic who would not tip his hat to any man. This was kind of he was kind of a representative of what de Tocqueville was talking about in terms of this habit of the heart, this culture of democracy that was in America. And it consisted of several things, he said: a strong belief in equality, that all people in the United States were equal, not by their financial means, that was obvious, of course, but that all people, and of course, again, he's restricting it to white men, had a sense that they were equal, not just equal under the law, but equal socially to anybody else, that anybody who acted superior to others was really committing a social faux pas, rather than the person who expected all people, expected their social betters to treat them equally. In other words, there's this culture of sort of strong sense of equality of all people in the United States. And again, restricted to white men. We have to, be aware of that limitation, of course. Also, a belief in individual initiative. To any man getting ahead, that there was this kind of social mobility, that anybody who had the gumption and the drive could make it in this country, could rise up above the station that he had been born to. And also, he talked about a belief in an active public sphere of participation in the affairs of the nation. What de Tocqueville marveled at was all of the voluntary organizations in America, all the organizations that were designed to improve the civic sphere, whether it be voluntary, whether it be charities, churches, political organizations. That there was this strong sense of everybody has a right to participate in this democracy, to shape this democracy by forming groups within the democracy to push for what they believed democracy should be all about, to push for their rights. And so it was this this idea of a belief in equality of all people within the republic, the idea that any man could get ahead, this idea of belief in individual initiative, and this idea of an active sphere in which people can participate in the affairs of the nation. In other words, Americans were not subjects, as they were in his own country of France at the time. They were not subjects of some monarchy, or they were not, they're being told what to do and just follow the lead of the government, but that they were citizens who actively took the affairs of their nation into their own hands. And this culture led to the pressure, going back to the expansion of the vote that we began this discussion about, that this idea that people have a right to participate in the political affairs of their country, is one of the forces of pressure that ends up kind of undermining and ultimately eliminating that business about property restrictions on the right to vote and to participate in the formal political affairs of the country, and leads to the ending of those restrictions. Now, of course, we must remember that his was always about males and always about whites, both of which were excluded. In terms of women and African Americans and Indians, all of which were excluded because of attitudes about their nature as inferior to white men. So in a sense, in a country that consisted of citizens, they remained voiceless and powerless subjects, just like people in monarchies in a sense. They had no right to participate. They had no equality, except that the monarchy here was not a king, but the mass of white men. That was the authority. All right, so in the next lecture, we're going to end this lecture now, and in the next lecture, we're going to take a look at the manifestation of what historians often refer to in terms of referring to the America before the Civil War. It's oftentimes referred to as a white man's republic. We're going to take a look at the culmination of that in the presidency of Andrew Jackson. So now I'm going to have you take a look at the quiz. Please answer the questions, include them in that document of the first questions you already answered, and then you'll send them to me when you've finished the third lecture, which follows this. So I will leave this up on the screen for about 15 seconds. Of course, you can also hit the pause button on your on the particular MP4 file that you're looking at.